It was supposed to be a quiet celebration. 40 years of marriage, no grand party, just a simple dinner with family. My husband had passed 2 years ago, but I still lit a candle for him. Still wore the gold pendant he gave me on our first anniversary. My son and his wife invited me over, said they wanted to honor the day. I smiled, grateful they remembered. After dinner, my daughter-in-law stood and said she had something special to read. She handed me a folded card and insisted I open it myself. Everyone waited. I read aloud, "Roses are dead, and so is the past. Maybe it's time you stop living in it." Laughter from her. Awkward silence from the others. I smiled, but something inside me cracked, not because it was cruel, but because my own son said nothing. I just sat there, holding the card, surrounded by people who didn't seem to realize that grief doesn't end on a calendar. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't about a poem. This was about something much deeper. I wasn't always this woman, the quiet one, sitting at the end of the table with a smile stretched too tight and a heart holding more weight than it should. There was a time I filled every room with laughter. My husband, James, said I had a way of turning silence into comfort. We were high school sweethearts who built a life out of almost nothing. We raised our only son, Matthew, in a modest home with chipped paint and laughter echoing down the hallways. James and I weren't rich, but we were steady. He worked as a mechanic. I worked night shifts at the local diner. We never traveled, never had matching luggage, but we had something better. Trust, rhythm, warmth. We shared our burdens like two oxen pulling the same cart. When James died of a sudden heart attack, I crumbled inside. The world didn't pause to grieve with me. Bills still came. The fridge still needed filling. And Matthew, my sweet, kind boy, he was grown and married by then. His wife, Alina, entered our lives just a few years before James passed. She was polite, beautiful, driven, the kind of woman who never forgot to say thank you, but always had an edge to her tone that made you wonder if she meant it. At first, I was eager to get to know her. I tried not to be the imshipia. I gave them space. I never criticized. I complimented her cooking, even when it was boxed mac and cheese. I offered help, but never imposed. Still, I always sensed she didn't like me. Not openly, but in ways you feel in your bones. She never looked me fully in the eye. She never asked about James. And whenever I brought up a story from the past, she'd yawn or change the subject. I chalked it up to personality differences, told myself to stay grateful that my son had someone, that they were building a life. But over time, I noticed the distance between me and Matthew growing. He stopped calling as much. Birthdays became afterthoughts. Holidays shortened. And even when I was around, I wasn't really seen. It hurt. But I kept showing up. Because that's what mothers do. And when they invited me over for my anniversary, I thought, maybe they remembered who I was. Maybe, despite everything, they still honored the love that raised the man Alina married. I was wrong. It wasn't a celebration. It was something else. Something colder. And I hadn't realized just how far I'd been pushed to the sidelines until that poem. The tension didn't appear overnight. It crept in slowly, like a shadow inching across the room that no one mentions until it swallows all the light. After James passed, I tried to stay strong, keep routines, and not make Matthew feel responsible for my loneliness. I didn't want to be that kind of mother, the one who clings, so I kept busy, took up knitting, joined a walking group, but nothing filled the space James left. Still, I smiled every time Alina and Matthew invited me over, even when it felt obligatory, even when I knew the invitation had likely come from Matthew, and Alina simply tolerated it. The shift became more obvious after they moved into their new house, a big, open concept place with white furniture and zero warmth. It looked like a catalogue, not a home. I brought over a framed photo of James and Matthew from a fishing trip. They smiled, arms slung over each other like best friends. I thought it would be a nice touch for their mantel. Alina thanked me with a tight smile and placed it in a side drawer, not even the guest room. From then on, little things started to pile up. I was always seated at the far end of the table. I'd cook something Matthew loved from childhood, and Alina would say, "Oh, we're trying to avoid heavy foods right now," before sliding it to the side. She never said anything cruel outright, but she didn't have to. The message was clear. You're part of his past. I am his future. What hurt more was watching Matthew adjust to it. I could see him pulling away, changing. He still hugged me hello, still asked how I was doing, but never in the way he used to, not with his whole heart. He became polite, detached, like I was a guest in a house I helped build. 1 week before my anniversary, I received a text, not a call, from Matthew. "Hey, Mom! Alina and I were thinking of doing a small dinner on Saturday for you. Just something simple." I stared at the message for a long time. My heart wanted to believe it came from love, but my gut told me something else. Still, I said yes. I wore James's favorite dress on the day. I baked the cinnamon rolls Matthew always begged for as a child, hoping to feel needed again. The house smelled like my old kitchen, like home. But when I arrived at their place, no one mentioned the anniversary. No candles, no framed photo of James, no toast. Just a long table with perfectly arranged napkins and stiff smiles. And then, after dinner, Alina handed me the card. "I thought you might appreciate a little poetry," she said, her voice honeyed and sharp. I opened it slowly, feeling a strange chill crawl up my spine. And when I read those words aloud, "Roses are dead, and so is the past," I knew. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was intentional. And my silence had lasted long enough. I don't know why I read it aloud. Maybe because everyone was watching me. Maybe because I still hoped, deep down, that it was some strange joke. A bad one, but harmless. But when I unfolded the cream-colored card and read those first few words, my voice caught. Roses are dead, and so is the past. There was a pause, a long one, like the room itself took a breath, waiting to see how I'd react. And then Alina laughed. Not a big laugh, just a smug little chuckle under her breath. But it was loud enough to sting. I kept reading. Memories fade, and so should regret. Let go of ghosts, or you'll have nothing left. The words echoed in my head like the beat of a drum, mocking, sharp, intentional. My hands trembled slightly as I lowered the card. I felt my cheeks burning, not from anger, but from shame. Public shame. On the very day that once meant everything to me. Everyone at the table stayed quiet. My son, Matthew, sat beside Alina, his mouth slightly open but empty of words. He didn't stop her. He didn't defend me. He didn't even pretend to be surprised. That silence broke something in me. I don't understand," I said, voice tight. Alina leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, as if she were explaining something to a child. "It's a poem, Margaret. A little light-hearted message. It's not meant to hurt. But it's true, isn't it? You live in the past. You still act like James is sitting beside you, but he's not. And there it was. The mask dropped. I looked at Matthew. His eyes flicked downward. He couldn't meet mine. I knew then he had read the poem before dinner. Maybe he even approved it. The rest of the evening blurred. I sat through dessert, some kind of dry almond cake Alina made from a gluten-free recipe, as if I wasn't the target of their smug performance. I smiled when I said goodbye. I even thanked them for dinner. But the second I stepped outside their house, I let the air out of my lungs in one long, shaking breath. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, the poem still clutched in my hand. My anniversary, a day once sacred, had been twisted into a public display of mockery. Not by strangers. By my own family. I didn't cry. Not yet. That came later, alone in my living room, with James's photo in my lap. I whispered, "You wouldn't believe what they did tonight." I wanted to be angry. I wanted to scream and tear that card into shreds, but all I could feel was numbness. I didn't just lose my husband. That night, I realized I had lost my son too, or at least the version of him who once held my hand as we walked to school, who used to beg for one more bedtime story, who said I was his hero. That boy was gone. And in his place sat a man who let his wife humiliate his mother, then stayed quiet. I had survived grief. But this was something colder. And for the first time in years, I didn't want to fight to stay close anymore. I spent that night wide awake. The card lay on my kitchen table like a slap I could still feel on my cheek. I kept reading it over and over, hoping I'd missed a line. Hoping maybe there was something tender in there I hadn't caught the first time. But there wasn't. It was mean-spirited, intentional, and worst of all, it was signed by both of them, Matthew and Alina. That crushed me more than I expected. I could almost forgive Alina. She didn't love me, that was obvious. Maybe she saw me as a burden or a relic from a past she didn't want to honor. But my son, my own flesh and blood, he had let it happen. And for what? For peace in his marriage? For Alina's approval? That night, I had a moment of terrifying clarity. I had spent years tiptoeing around them, shrinking myself so I wouldn't overstep, staying grateful for crumbs just to remain included. I didn't speak up when Alina cut me off mid-sentence. I smiled when she handed me thoughtless gifts. I even laughed when she called James the sentimental type, as if that were a flaw. But the poem was the final straw. This wasn't about the past anymore. This was about respect, and I had let mine be eroded. The next morning, I put on my nicest coat and walked to their house without calling ahead. My hands were steady this time, my voice calm. I rang the bell and waited. Alina answered the door, surprised. She had a robe on and coffee in her hand. "Margaret," she said, blinking. "Did you forget something?" "No," I said. "But you did." Before she could respond, Matthew appeared behind her, still groggy, hair messy. He looked like the boy I once raised for a flicker of a second. "I came to talk to both of you," I said, "and I'd like you to listen." They stood there, awkward, but they didn't stop me. "I want to make one thing clear," I began. "Yesterday wasn't just hurtful. It was humiliating. And the fact that both of you thought that card was acceptable says a lot more about you than it does about me." Matthew opened his mouth, but I raised a hand. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to say I'm done being quiet." Alina crossed her arms. "It was just a joke, Margaret." I looked her straight in the eyes. Cruelty dressed as poetry is still cruelty. Then I turned to Matthew. You didn't just let her mock me, you joined her, and I want you to sit with that." He didn't say anything. I took a breath, steadied myself, and added, "You both owe me nothing, and starting today, I won't chase after a place in your lives. If you want a relationship, it'll be on my terms, with respect." And then I walked away. For the first time in years, I walked away with my dignity intact, and my heart finally waking up to what I truly deserved. Walking away wasn't loud. There was no slamming door, no dramatic tears, no raised voices. Just the quiet sound of my heels on their front porch as I turned around and left. But inside me, everything had shifted. For years I had swallowed every sting, smiled through every dismissal, convinced myself that being included, barely, was better than being forgotten. I let my son's silence excuse his wife's cruelty. I told myself, it's just the times, it's a new generation. Don't be the difficult mother-in-law. But yesterday, on the very day James and I had once promised forever, I realized something. I had let them bury me before I was gone, and I had been complicit in it. That poem wasn't just a tasteless joke. It was a message, a final nudge to step aside, to erase myself gently while smiling for the photos. But I'm not a ghost, and I'm not done yet. In the days that followed, I didn't hear from them. Not a call, not a message. The silence was loud, but it didn't hurt like it used to. Instead, I filled my days with people who saw me, truly saw me. I had tea with old friends who asked real questions and waited for real answers. I pulled out my old piano sheet music and started playing again. I volunteered twice a week at the library, reading to children who hung on to every word like I still mattered. And slowly, I began to feel like myself again. Not the version of me that begged for love in hushed tones, but the woman James had loved. The woman who laughed from her belly, who believed in handwritten letters and second chances. Matthew had grown into a man I didn't recognize, and maybe one day he'd see that. Maybe not. But I'd no longer bleed myself dry, hoping for that moment. Because closure, I realized, doesn't always come from an apology. Sometimes it comes from choosing yourself. I hung the poem on my refrigerator, not as a wound, but as a reminder. That was the day I remembered my own worth. That was the day I stopped being afraid to take up space. I still think of James often. Sometimes I sit by the window with a cup of tea and whisper, "You'd be proud of me today." And I like to believe he is.